recapitalization. Been here at HUD just a few days after doing a lot of RAD work in the field. And as you all know, the Office of Recapitalization is the office responsible for the implementation of RAD. On Monday, we published the revised RAD notice to implement the expansion of the program that Congress authorized in the fiscal 15 spending bill, and to incorporate a variety of other lessons learned from the experience with RAD and integrated feedback we've gotten over the last several months. We're holding a series of webinars today to help all of you as our partners and stakeholders to understand the revisions better. I'm sure you're all going to need to read the notice, but this is an overview of those revisions. We hope to help you understand the changes little by little and give you the information you need for a successful conversion. And to that end, we'll be providing additional venues for questions and answers around the notice over the next few weeks, and are working on some additional guidance and tools which we'll be making available as soon as possible. This particular webinar is specifically focused on the rent supp and RAP portions of the RAD notice, so section 3 of the RAD notice, covering a variety of topics, but including the expansion of the under the statute, which allows the conversion to PBRA, and some modifications and adjustments to the PBB portion of the rent supp and RAP. And without any further stalling on my part, I'm going to turn this over to Katie Buchner, who has spearheaded a lot of this work and has been doing a lot of the component 2 work for the Office of RAD Recapitalization. Katie.
All right, thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. So this will just be about rent supp and RAP, as you said. So this is a live GoToMeeting, and our next slide sort of illustrates how you can ask questions throughout the presentation and at the end. You need to raise your hand, and then when you raise your hand, you will be able to, our helpers here in the room will be able to identify that you have a question, and will be able to unmute your line, and you can ask your question. So I welcome questions throughout the presentation and at the end. You can also ask questions via rad@hud.gov, and we will get to those questions throughout the presentation as well. All right, so Tom kind of touched on this, but I'll repeat it because I think it's important to remind everyone why we wrote a revised notice and what we've been working on for the last few months. We're incorporating key expansion changes authorized by the fiscal year 15 appropriations bill, which increased the cap on public housing conversions, opened up eligibility for mod rehab McKinney-Vento SRO, it incorporated lessons from the previous 2 years, including policy gaps and processing issues that we've encountered in this office, and it hopefully will clarify some common questions that we always receive that we're processing these transactions. So some of us are visual learners, and this slide is for those who really need to see it to sort of understand it. So there's animations in this slide. So as you can see, the cap has been lifted to 185,000 units from 60,000 units. Applications now will be accepted through 9/30/2018 to 9/30/2015. Mod rehab now will include McKinney-Vento SROs. There's no expiration for rent supp RAP conversions, which is what this presentation is about. It also expands the rent supp RAP universe to allow them to convert to PBRA under the second component. And it puts all mod rehab conversions under the second component of RAD. They were previously processed under both the first component and the second component. All right. So here we are, the rent supp RAP universe. So just an important point on implementation. So generally, unless otherwise noted, the revisions to this notice, they're effective for all transactions that have not submitted their conversion requests after previous versions of the notice. I know that there are a lot of you out on the line that have previously submitted an application with the intention of going under PBB before the sunset was lifted, and now are probably thinking, well, maybe I want to do a PBRA conversion. We'll work with you as an office to allow you to do that, but you will need to submit additional documentation and have another tenant meeting and things like that. Those things are being worked out, but I don't want to scare anybody to think that you're locked into whatever you applied to previously. Just a note. So some eligibility changes in the new notice. So for PBB conversions, projects must qualify as existing housing in order to convert. They technically need to exist they need to be existing housing for PBRA conversions, but that's not really a term that's used in PBRA world. So I note this for PBB conversions only. And the reason why this is important is because a PHA must determine that the project substantially complies with HQS through an initial inspection before they can be selected as a project under the second component of RAD. What this essentially does is it gets rid of AHAPs in second component conversion, a mechanism that really wasn't used previously. So that is one important point about eligibility. Another important point is that retroactive conversions will be limited to PBB conversions only. Now that we're introducing PBRA conversions, we wanted to make sure that we just limited the retroactive conversions to PBB. We didn't see operationally how we could really allow a retroactive PBRA conversion. And the final point on eligibility is that previously decoupled projects will now be eligible to convert. They were not previously eligible to convert without a waiver, and so how they will be able to convert is the project will be allowed to convert if HUD and the owner mutually agree to terminate the rent Supp or RAP contract, and that will be the triggering event for the RAD conversion. All right. So some other changes in the third section of the notice, the resident provisions. So we have this right to remain or return, and how we're going to implement that is we're going to limit screening of current households upon conversion, and we're establishing a right to remain or return to families living at project at time of conversion. Some other resident provisions that we're including is we're clarifying the protections for overhouse families, which was included in the last revision to this notice, but they weren't very explicit. The instructions weren't very explicit, so we have made sure that there is absolute information about how overhouse families residing at rent Supp RAP properties will be treated at the time of conversion, and we provided clear instructions for inclusion of HDV holders onto the project-based contract.
Can you have a spot for a question?
Sure.
Jennifer McCarthy, we've unmuted your line if you have a question.
Hi, Jennifer.
Jennifer, you might be on mute. You might need to unmute your phone. All right, we'll come back to you.
All right, so this next sort of sets of slides dealing specifically with the PBRA conversions, which I'm sure most of you have a ton of questions about of how this is going to work and what this is going to look like. So I want to say that a PBRA submission will be very similar to a PBB submission, but these next slides will outline sort of what is different and what will be expected at the time of application. So the first submission requirement that will be a little bit different is the environmental review. So for a PBRA conversion, owners will be required to submit reports and documentation to HUD in order to facilitate HUD, or the Office of RECAP's environmental review under Part 50 in accordance with the submission requirements of Chapter 9 of the MAP Guide. So for PBB conversions, this was generally done by the PHA, and now that a PHA is not going to be involved in a PBRA conversion, the owner and HUD will be the responsible parties to the Part 50 review. So another new submission requirement will be that owners will be required to submit an RCS prepared in accordance with the Section 8 Renewal Guide in order to establish initial rents for the new PBRA contract. And I'm going to go into sort of, oh, sorry. So an RCS is a rent comparability study. And so there's instructions in the Section 8 renewal guide on how you are supposed to prepare and submit those, and that is what we will use as a proxy for a RAD conversion. So you're probably wondering why we're using an RCS to establish initial contract rents, and these next two slides will sort of go over the rent setting for a PBRA conversion. So for projects with rents, with units that would be undergoing initial repairs, the contract rents will be established at the lesser of the post-rehab rents as determined by an RCS, or 110% of the applicable FMR less utility allowances. So if you submit an RCS that shows post-rehab rents of $1,000 and 110% of the applicable FMR is $1,200, you would receive the $1,000 that were determined by the RCS. If those numbers were switched, the RCS said $1,200 and the 110% of FMR said $1,000, then you would be limited to 110% of the applicable FMR. So the owners will be required to submit an RCS that includes both as-is rents and post-rehab rents. We will be allowing you to realize the post-rehab rents at the time of the RAD conversion, with the understanding that repairs must be completed in a timely fashion, and a completion date for repairs will be established in the PBRA contract. If repairs are not completed within the established time frame, HUD may mark rents down to as-is rent levels and will offset future HAP payments by what was overpaid to the owner during that time where you were receiving post-rehab rents. They will calculate sort of an overpayment of sorts. So for projects with units that are not undergoing initial repairs, then you will simply submit an RCS that shows what your rents are, and you will be subject to the 110% of FMR test. So after your initial rents are set, I'm sure you're all wondering what happens to your rents in years 2, 3, 4, etc. And so rents will be adjusted by HUD's OCAF at each anniversary of the HAP contract, but cannot exceed the maximum rent. So the maximum rent is a new concept that's introduced to RAD conversions, and it's defined as the higher of 110% of FMR less utility allowances, or the market rent as determined by an RCS. So an RCS will remain valid for 5 years. So when you establish your initial rents, you will have an RCS that will remain valid for 5 years. So for 5 years, you will get your OCAF. At year 5, I guess for 4 years you will get your OCAF. At year 5, we'll ask you to submit another RCS in order to receive your OCAF. And if the RCS says that the OCAF lines up with what your market rents are, then you will continue to receive the OCAF for another 5 years. But if not, you'll be limited to 110%. Or if you choose not to submit an RCS in year 5, you'll still just be limited to 110% without receiving an OCAF. I know that's very confusing, but I can't explain it any better. And any questions you might have or any examples that I could provide, you can send an email to rad2@hud.gov or to me personally, and I'll try to walk you through this sort of confusing process. And then the final different piece of submission that you will need to provide for a PBRA conversion is a CNA. And owners will be required to submit a CNA, but we've carved out sort of 3 exceptions to when you will not need to submit a CNA to HUD. So the first exception is projects that are undergoing rehab and who have provided a scope of work and an RCS to establish PBRA contract rents. For those projects, you will not need to submit a CNA. Projects that have had a PCA or a CNA done in the last 10 years will also not be required to submit a CNA. And projects where the total assisted units of the project will comprise of less than 20% of the total units of the project will also not be required to submit a CNA. I will note, and I didn't put this on the slide because I'm not sure, it's an important note, but I didn't include it, is that we're transitioning to the new CNAE tool. So for now, you can use the PCA that was outlined in the previous version of the RAD notice, but within 6 months of the CNAE tool being published, you'll be required to use that as in lieu of the PCNA or the PCA. All right. So that's sort of it for PBRA. The next slide is about clarifications to the PBB program that were included in the notice. So the first sort of point is that we clarify that only occupied units at the time of conversion will be included on the PBB contract. This has led to a lot of confusion and processing of second component transactions over the last few years. It was actually included in the original notice that we would fund unoccupied units. It was removed from subsequent versions of the notice, and this is driven by what is being funded for out of the tenant protection voucher account right now. So we included that clarification in the notice, so there should be no more questions about what you can be included on the PV contract in terms of unoccupied units. The second point that we clarified is that we clarified that only units that are occupied by tenants whose income will generate a subsidy will be included on the PBB HAP contract. What I mean by that is if a tenant's income is 30% of a tenant's income is $700 and the contract rent is $600, that unit cannot be included on the PBB HAP contract. We also provided instructions on how to include these units on the contract at a later time if for some reason income changes or rents go up that would cause that tenant to have a subsidy be generated on their behalf. The next clarification in the PBB conversion world is that we're allowing rent Supp contracts to remain in place at the time of conversion to prevent conflict with PBB rent setting rules. As you know, as many of you on the line know, when you prepay a 236 project and you're decoupling, you are limited. You cannot increase rents for 60 days following the preservation event. And PBB rent setting rules say that your PBB rents cannot exceed the basic rent at the property. So by allowing the rent Supp contract to remain in place, this will allow time for the 236 rents at the property to increase to the level that the owner wishes their PBB rents to also be increased to. With the important caveat that all the other PBB rent setting rules will still apply to that particular project and 983 subpart G. And the final point, which is for an external audience, is probably not all that important, but the notice does clarify recap and PIH responsibilities for funding requests for PBB contracts. And that is that's the end of the material, but I am hoping that you all have some question and answer, and I can answer them hopefully. So please do not be shy.
We have a couple of written questions.
Okay.
Hope we've got a hand. Okay. Henry, you have a question?
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you. Do you have a question?
Yes, can you speak to Davis Bacon, please? Does Davis Bacon apply to PBRA deals?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Zoe, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about, can you talk a little bit about the eligibility of housing choice mobile voucher holders under the PBRA context in the event of a PBRA RAD conversion?
So, hi Zoe. It'll be the same mechanism as it would be for a PBV conversion. So you will have to, there will have to be a preservation eligible prepayment at the property, and the tenant will have to be given a consultation and have to provide consent for their voucher to be included onto the PBRA contract.
And who would be doing that? In that context, would it be the owner who would be managing that process and running the numbers? I guess I'm just curious, like, where the EV would be coming from, because, you know, if they choice mobility after the fact.
Right. So the Public Housing Authority would have to be involved in that process, and I'm not sure. I think Diane is on the line to maybe answer this more fully, but the PHA would have to come out and give the tenant their rights to an enhanced voucher and explain those, and would have to walk them through the relinquishment process.
Okay, so we would work with whoever, so say we have a property that has like 100 mobile voucher holders and with like 5 different PHAs, we'd have to work with each of those mobile voucher PHAs up through the EV process, but then they would go to HUD. I mean, but then they would be either the choice of either getting an EV through that housing authority or being part of the PBRA contract.
Health check 2015. Your free health screen.
I'm sorry, Zoe. There's like a overhead announcement in this room right now, so I couldn't exactly hear the last 2 minutes of what you said.
Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll say it again. And if I'm being confusing, I apologize.
No, it's okay.
For a mobile voucher holder, we have a property with like 100 mobile voucher holders through 5 different PHAs. So we'd get each one of the PHAs to talk to their voucher holders at the site through their options, either keep your voucher now, convert to an EV, or you'd be part of the new PBRA contract. And then so that housing authority would walk through those options and run the numbers for them on those 3 scenarios?
Yes. And Diane,
Katie, I can answer the question. This is Diane Thompson from the Office of Public and Indian Housing. So if you have a project that's converting to PBRA and there are housing choice voucher holders that are already living in units in that project, unless a preservation prepayment has occurred, then that family's form of assistance will remain the same. It will just be a regular tenant voucher.
Yeah, we're doing a prepayment, so this would be under the concept of a prepayment.
Okay, so if there's a preservation prepayment, the family has a right to an enhanced voucher. And the enhanced voucher process would work the same, where the public housing field office would identify a housing authority to administer vouchers for that prepayment. And that may or may not be one of the same housing authorities that's currently administering vouchers. More than likely, it will be one of them, and so we'll have to work through issues with other housing authorities that are administering housing choice vouchers where the family wants to accept the enhanced voucher assistance that's being administered by another PHA. That happens in the regular enhanced voucher world, and that's something we can talk about later. But the family would be briefed by the housing authority that would be assigned to administer that enhanced voucher assistance. And however, the PBRA, I'm not sure how the PBRA conversion is working because housing agencies aren't involved. I'm assuming, Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, that housing authority would have to somehow relay that information to the recap office once the briefing has taken place and the families have made their decision whether or not to relinquish their enhanced voucher for the PBRA assistance or to accept the enhanced voucher and remain in the unit. Or they can decline that enhanced voucher and continue to receive their housing choice voucher assistance through whatever housing authority is administering it. It's a bit complicated. Katie, do you know whether we've worked out how those PHAs will communicate? Will they communicate to the recap office or to the transaction managers?
Yeah, I would assume that we would want the housing authority to inform us whether or not the housing choice voucher holder, what they had decided to do. And so I think that this will be sort of I hate to say this, but we're going to have to, there's going to be kinks that obviously are going to have to be worked out as we go through this process. But, I mean, in my mind, and I think in this office's mind, it'll work almost exactly the same way as it should work under a PBB conversion, the only difference being that at the end of the day, what the tenant is relinquishing their HCV for is to be included on a PBRA contract instead of a PBB contract.
Yeah, I think for that, I think the one question I have, I'm great. I'm so happy that we still have the option under the PBRA context to get the mobile voucher holders online. But then I guess how would choice mobility work after the 1-year time limit?
So there is no choice mobility built into a PBRA conversion for Rent Supp RAD.
Okay.
But so yeah, I think Zoe that this is it's a very weedy question. So maybe we can talk offline, or we're going to have a Q&A session on Friday, and we can maybe think about this and provide a better answer on Friday.
Sure. Okay.
All right, thanks, Eddie.
So, yeah, so Katie, I can be involved in that conversation.
All right.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make one point of clarification on the previous slide. I'm sorry, I was muted, so I wasn't able to make the point at the time. But on the previous slide, it refers to occupied units at the time of conversion, and I think we determined that it's actually at the time of the eligibility event, because if the conversion is sometime after the eligibility event and there's families that have moved in, those families are not eligible. So it would be at the time of the eligibility event, whether that be the prepayment or the termination of the rent Supp or the RAD contract.
I mean, hopefully conversions happen almost simultaneously with the eligibility event.
Hopefully they do, but
yeah.
Just to be clear, it's at the time of the eligibility event, because under the law, only families that are living in the units at the time of the eligibility event are entitled to tenant protection assistance.
Okay. Yes, at the time of the eligibility event.
Ed Lele, we've unmuted your line if you have a question.
Yeah, are we going to be getting copies of these slides?
Yes, we can email out the slides to all registrants after the webinar.
Thank you.
We'll also post them on the website today.
Kathy, you have a question? We've unmuted your line.
My question is that if we're going to do the option of a 20-year HAP, is that going to be administered by the local housing authority or by, in our case, a HUD Buffalo office or a project administrator?
We're still working that out.
Okay.
It's definitely not a public housing authority, Kathy, but either HUD or the PBCA.
Okay. So in my situation, I have RAP and 236. So the 236 would just stay as it is. And then for my vacant RAP, if I'm in the unfortunate position of having vacants at the time of eligibility, what do those become?
Kathy, like a transaction-specific question, I can give you a call and I can walk you through that.
Okay.
How about that?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Maria, we've unmuted your line for your question.
Hi, Maria.
You might need to unmute your line, Maria.
So sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Maria Maffei from Boston. With the PBRA contract, who is going to do the initial tenant certifications, and then what happens for the annual recertifications?
So the owner. So are you talking about income certifications?
Yeah, and eligibility.
Right. So so you're going from a rent Supp RAP and a 236 with basic tenant status who are already getting income certified by multifamily, correct? Like you're under a multifamily platform.
Yeah, the owners are doing the.
Right. So the owners will continue to do the certifications.
Okay, and they'll maintain their own wait lists, and so their operations will largely look the same.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Maria, we've unmuted your line. Do you have a question?
No, I just asked my question.
Oh, another Maria. Sorry, Maria Kuloya?
No, I didn't. Actually, the last question answered mine. So.
Great.
Perfect.
All right, Vince, we've unmuted your line.
Hi. Question: If my in a PBRA RAD 2 deal, if the market rents are clearly much higher than 110% of FMR initially, can the owner forego the RCS and just take 110?
That's a good question. I think that we need to think about that scenario.
Okay, because I mean, you know, in 5 years they could do another RCS if it's relevant, but it might not be relevant for a long time if there's a big spread.
Right.
Thank you.
Lisa Kimmis, we've unmuted your line.
Thank you. I have a question that relates to the PBB conversions.
All right.
And Diane clarified the eligibility event is actually the prepayment or the termination of the contract. So let's say we have a property that has 100 units, but at the time of the eligibility event, there's only 80 units that are occupied. So in that scenario, HUD will only provide the PHA funding for 80 units, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So as the PHA, we still have the discretion within our budget authority to add units to the owner's HAP contract up to 3 years after the HAP is executed, correct?
No, that's not correct. And we do clarify that in the notice. Under
so I'm sorry. So that provision under the PBB regulations is not applicable to RAD. We can no longer add units out of our own budget authority?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
thank you.
You're welcome.
Maria, you have another question?
Yeah, can you talk about the second tenant meeting? What's the purpose of it, and when is it to be held?
I don't think there's any hard or fast deadline for when your second tenant meeting needs to be held, but we do recognize that these conversions can sometimes take a long time, and so we are encouraging owners to have a second tenant meeting to sort of talk about the progress of the conversion. I think that how this will work operationally is that we will send an approval letter with the condition that you cannot convert until you provide evidence that you've had a second tenant meeting. And we also recognize that owners are often meeting with residents more than once during the conversion process.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Got a bunch of written questions. We have a written question from Nicole asking, how will Overhouse residents be handled? Where can we find that explanation?
All right, so Overhouse residents, so if you're elderly or disabled, they will be allowed to remain in those units until an appropriate size unit becomes available in the project. And that's for single residents. Families that are in an Overhouse unit will also be able to remain in the unit until an appropriate size unit becomes available. And so this is outlined in both the special provisions for PBBs, which is 3.6 or 3.5, I'm sorry, and the special provisions of PBRA in 3.6.
Great. Another written question from William Emerson asking, how does the right to return work when the underlying asset is being disposed and residents are moving to a new site?
So in that situation, URA would apply, but I think that if you're considering disposing a rent Supp or RAP project as in the context of a RAD conversion, you would need to talk to this office before doing that.
We have another written question from Abby Brum asking, can we convert Section 236 units under Section 3 to PBRA?
Yeah, and I probably should have put that right on the slide, and I'll actually include it on the printed slides when they're posted on the website. So yeah, the eligible units for PBRA are the same as the eligible units for a PBB conversion.
Another written question from Valerie Garrity asking, how are rents set for PBV? Is it limited to 110% FMR?
So rents are set for PBV in accordance with the 24,983 subpart G, and so it is that there's a three-prong test. It's the 110% of FMR, the reasonable rent, or the owner requested rent, the lesser of those three things.
So it's an amount not to exceed 110% of the FMR as determined by the PHA.
Yeah.
So some PHAs limit the PBB rents to their payment standards under the voucher program, which may not be up to 110%. So it's an amount not to exceed 110% of the mark as determined by the PHA, and then the other two prongs that Katie mentioned, the lesser of those three.
Yeah.
Great. We have another written question from Eileen Hardy, asking, the notice states that HUD multifamily staff would be at tenant meetings. How does this work with limitations on travel funds?
So if the HUD multifamily staff due to travel cannot be physically present, they can call into that meeting.
A question from Gwen Volk asking, so if a tenant voucher is provided to a tenant who does not wish to remain, is the unit they vacate also have subsidy to offer a new tenant?
No.
Another question from Avi Brum. This is in a 236 prepayment with an expiring RAP contract. Asking, can we not only convert RAP units but also 236 units whose subsidy is set to expire upon loan maturity loan prepayment?
If the 236 prepayment would trigger the issuance of vouchers, those vouchers can be included on the PBV or PBRA contract.
But specifically to answer her question, if the mortgage is maturing and not being prepaid, then the answer is no.
Right. Yes.
We have a written question from Matt Snow asking, will you clarify what qualifies as undergoing rehabilitation when a CNA exemption applies? Is this just to facilitate projects already further along in processing?
Let me look at the exact language that we say in the notice. So if they're undergoing rehabilitation and that information is captured in the RCS that is provided to set PBRA rents, then they would not be able to, they wouldn't be required to submit a CNA. If they are undergoing, I don't think I exactly understand your question, but the exemptions are pretty clearly set out in the notice. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. I'm sorry.
A question from David Pearson asking if a third-party energy audit utility allowance can be utilized to set the utility allowance upon conversion.
Let me get back to you on that, David.
So is that question specific to, we don't know if it's PBV or PBRA. For PBV,
no, we don't.
Right. So just for PBV, the housing authority's tenant-based utility allowance has to be used. If there's a need to request a waiver, we can certainly entertain that. But generally, the housing authorities, the regulation requires that the housing authority use their tenant-based utility allowance.
Great. It looks like we've got another question from Renee Greenman. We've unmuted your line.
Sorry, that was an error. I apologize. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Vince O'Donnell, you have another question?
Hi, this is Vince O'Donnell again. For a partially assisted 236 with a prepayment, there can be tenants between 80 and 95% of AMI who are eligible for EVs. Two parts. Do I assume correctly those tenants cannot be included in a PBV or PBRA option because they're over 80? And secondly, if they move, and this is actually not a RAD question, if they move, are they still eligible for that HCV when they move, given that they're over 80?
Do you want me to answer that, Katie?
Yeah, Diane can answer that.
Okay. So, yes, if the tenant is over 80, they're not eligible for the project-based voucher program, but that family is eligible for that enhanced voucher. So if the family wishes to remain in that unit with their enhanced voucher, that unit, of course, couldn't be included under the project-based voucher contract. If the family wishes to move, then the regular requirements under PIH 2001-41 would apply, where that family could move, but that assistance would become just regular tenant-based assistance without the enhanced voucher features.
But even though they're over 80%, they can still use the voucher, assuming...
If they would receive an assistance payment, yes, because if it's a preservation prepayment, moderate income families are eligible. And you can find that information in PIH Notice 2001-41.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And for PBRA, Vince, we're going to have to think about how those 80 to 95% tenants will be treated.
Okay, thanks.
Zoe, you have another question?
Sorry, just to follow up on Vince's question. I know the 80 to 95% for families has one category of eligibility, but there's also a different level of eligibility for elderly or disabled households for the people who are over between 80 and 95%? Or is there?
If it's a preservation prepayment, yes, there is a category for elderly and disabled. It's contained within 2001-41, and the rules would be the same. Those families, if they're between that 80 and 95%, they are not going to be eligible for the PBB program, but they may be eligible for an enhanced voucher, provided it's a preservation prepayment.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have some more written questions. One from Jerome Frank asking, in my reading, I thought an RCS would allow a PHA to charge 150% of FMR, but the PowerPoint slide indicated 110% FMR. Has the 150% provision gone away in this revised notice?
Yeah, I think this is a first component sort of concept and not a second component concept.
Second component has always been limited to 110% of FMR
Right.
as the max.
Yep.
Okay. A question from David Pearson. Under PBRA, does the limit of converting 50% of the units apply? Are you still able to provide certain resident services to lift that limit?
No cap in PBRA conversion.
Scrolling through. A question from Rosa Estrada. Is there any criteria for preparation of the rent comp study? Can this be prepared by any market study analyst?
You have to follow the guidance that's in Chapter 8 of the Section 8 Renewal Guide.
A written question from Eileen asking, how do the PBB rents interact at a 236 site with the basic and market rents? How do rent increases work going forward between the two programs?
So the PBB rents are limited by the basic rents at the property, and previously in a decoupled project, there's a specific reg that it's 24-983-304 that outlines how those two interact. But rent increases for your basic units, if you still have basic units, will still be governed by the basic rent increases in the handbook. And then the PBB rents on a yearly basis can be redetermined in accordance with the PBB regs.
Okay, David Pearson's raised his hand. David, we've unmuted your line.
Thank you. Thinking ahead, for maybe the next tax credit recapitalization that could be, 10 to 15 years away, depending on where you convert within the cycle. Are you able at that time, say there's only 5 years left on a PBRA contract, at that time, are you able to renew it for a new 20-year contract and able to do a new preservation deal? And if so, what are your renewal options? Is it just an extension, or can you renew under like a markup to market, or just option 2?
So David, the initial PBRA contract is for 20 years, and
right.
And after that you can renew under MARA. Now I think that you're trying to get us to say, oh, you can terminate and come in for a MARA contract early, which I don't think any of us are contemplating when it comes to a second component RAD conversion.
Okay, so if you do it now in connection with the tax credit deal, and then in 15 years when the initial compliance period ends and you do a new, maybe recapitalize it or sell it, and somebody else wants to recapitalize it with a new round of bonds and credits and a renovation, there may be potential to get an additional 20-year contract, or it's just unclear at this point.
I don't think there's an option. I don't think there's an option to renew under MARA until the 20-year contract has ended.
Okay.
It's why the deals will also be underwritten for 20 years when they're reviewed.
We have another written question. This one's from Jim Tilley asking, is there no requirement for a life cycle cost analysis when switching from natural gas to all electric for heating, water heating, cooking, and drying?
I don't know how to answer that particular question, but I think that I can get back to you.
Thanks, Judy. We've got a hand raised from David Keene. David, we've unmuted your line.
Yes, I have a question about Davis-Bacon. If we provide as a lender a bridge loan for a year or two with rehab following, say, the 2-year period under the tax credit, 4% tax credits, would Davis-Bacon be required as part of the RAD transaction?
No, the guidance says it's within the first 18 months.
Okay, thank you.
But you also have to be careful that when you're coming in, you're converting with the post-rehab rents. You won't be able to recognize the post-rehab rents because they'll be beyond that initial period we allow.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, looks like that's it for questions. Oh, got one more. With the addition of the RCS process, what happens when the post-rehab RCS rents exceed the current funding calculation?
So I think this is also sort of conflating first component with second component. So under second component, we're not limited to what the current funding of the rent Supp or RAP contract is. Instead, we're pulling from other sources of funding in order to fund these new long-term contracts.
Scanning for any more questions. Zoe, we've unmuted your line.
Sorry to keep on pestering you. I noticed in the notice that the sample resident notice for the resident information meeting was not included. And will you be putting together a new version of the notice or sample notice?
Yeah, Zoe. So we decided to take them out of the notice so that we would have more flexibility in changing them because they won't have to go through the same clearance process that a notice has to go through. And so yeah, they'll be posted on the website.
Great, thanks.
Shanda Tai, we've unmuted your line.
So we wanted to just verify that the post-rehab rents are available immediately after closing pre-rehab, but there's a time frame, as you stated earlier, if it's not completed, that the rents might be marked down. That was the first question. The second question was, may a lender-ordered report stand in place of the RCS report, or do they have to have an RCS irrespective?
For the first question, yes, you can have the post-rehab rents at the closing of the conversion. And the second question is that you will need to provide an RCS as outlined in the notice. I'm sure there's maybe some flexibility there, but it would require like a waiver or something like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Last call for questions.
All right, if that's all the questions, I'd like to remind you that we're having a Q&A session on Friday. What time is it at, Greg?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock? 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock. And in the interim, we'll take the written questions that were provided today and the verbal questions that we didn't have the right answers for, and we will try to get those posted somewhere so that we can sort of make sure that we're addressing new questions in the Friday Q&A session. So I want to thank you all for your active participation and happy reading of the notice as we get further and further into this whole process. Thanks very much.